I owe you an update and a retractment of what we talked about yesterday regarding the Air India 171 crash, because we have new information that could add at least to some of our understanding of what happened, but also opens up yet even more questions. So as you already know, just to catch you up to speed, if you don't want to be caught up to speed, skip ahead about a minute, but this is Air India 171. Almost 300 people died as this aircraft lost lift in what appears to be, at least at this point, believed to be a dual engine failure, which becomes important. We don't see what appears to be a flame out from a bird strike. We don't see a lot of adverse law, a little bit of bank we see to the left. That could potentially be indicative of trying to guide away from buildings ahead as essentially the pilots roll away in this tragedy that occurs, but no indications of a loss of a single engine, though even Boeing's mechanisms can minimize any kind of adverse yaw if we just lost one engine. But if we just lost one engine here, we left the gear out, it's unlikely that this Boeing 787 Dreamliner would actually end up crashing and losing all lift. So what does that leave us with, and what do we have to retract from yesterday? Well, I threw together a quick little note sheet just to give you the idea. We don't see the visible bird strike. We don't think pulling up the gear or the wrong flap setting is a major issue here. We've talked about these items in different videos, and these aircraft can fly just fine, even if we're one setting off on the flap setting or we have the gear down. These aircraft are really designed to be able to maintain thrust and a climb rate, even with just one engine. So that really leaves us with some form of dual engine failure leading to either the automatic or manual ram air turbine deployment. Now, what could have caused this dual engine failure could be a whole host of things. Some form of crazy FADEC reset, fuel contamination, some form of fuel pump failure or lockup, a catastrophic electrical failure, or an intentional issue. And so as a jet pilot, I've familiarized myself with many different emergency procedures for a dual engine failure. And yesterday, we talked about this article from Air Current, where Air Current describes this potential for the fuel switches having been adjusted prior to the impact. And so a lot of people are now focused on these fuel control switches and what position they were in and why they were potentially manipulated before impact. Now, I've watched other videos and creators talk about this, and not a lot of creators have begun to talk about the procedure for the specific 787 Dreamliner. And it sort of shows that this procedure is very different from what you typically see in a Boeing aircraft or potentially another aircraft. For example, I'm type rated in the Phenom 300 E-Jet as a pilot in command, also solo pilot, which is rare to fly a jet solo. And every aircraft has different emergency procedures, but there's often a lot of overlap. For example, one place there's overlap is in the concern regarding these switches, that these switches can't be accidentally switched off. Why would both fuel valve switches be switched off? And for most normal emergency procedures, for us to potentially see these emergency switches turned off, even in the event of a dual engine failure, would be quite odd. Take a look at some of these different emergency procedures for a dual engine failure or a loss of thrust on both engines. You might see engine start switches adjusted. You might see the thrust levers reset. For example, on our aircraft on the Phenom, you go to idle, you put your oxygen masks on, you establish communications, and you land as soon as possible. Those are basically your memory items for dual engine failure. And then, of course, if you have the altitude, you can go through potential relighting through either automated relighting or, depending on if you have enough speed, windmilling to restart these engines, you can go through windmilling restart procedures. This is very normal for an aircraft. On the Boeing 737, for a loss of thrust on both engines, you would go through also manipulating the levers for thrust. You'd be watching the temperatures of the turbine engines. And based on what altitude you're at, you would go to different steps in the future. See, as you can see on the left here, above flight level 270, you would follow one set of instructions. below flight level 270, which is 27,000 feet, you'd follow yet another set of instructions. Now, what's unique in the Dreamliner, which we didn't mention yesterday, and I apologize for that, in the enthusiasm to share information about the latest information that we're getting regarding what caused this accident, we didn't specifically look for that model's checklist. And it is vastly different from that of other aircraft. And for that, I apologize. That's a failure. But the beautiful thing about making these videos is we get to learn together and expand our aviation knowledge, and ultimately we try to make aviation safer for everyone. It's actually what got me into aviation, was watching people's videos like PIlotDebrief or Captain Steeeve or Mentour Pilot or whatever, whom I respect greatly, and I think they're all wonderful creators. And when everyone contributes to making the industry safer. And so even though not a lot of people have talked about it yet, what I have is a screenshot of the emergency procedures for the 787 Dreamliner, which was the Air India 171 flight. And remember, the question is, why were those fuel control switches moved to cut off? They don't accidentally go to cut off, which is what was mentioned in the Air Current article or other articles, that it's potential, that there's a potential that some of these fuel control switches were potentially improperly, inadvertently, or intentionally switched off. An intentional switch off of these fuel control switches would be very bad. If you intentionally switch these switches off by lifting them and pushing them down past their gate, you will very rapidly lose engine thrust. Some of the pilots in comments yesterday suggested you would almost instantaneously lose engine thrust, especially during a high power phase of flight like takeoff. However, the 787 Dreamliner has very unique procedures, which you don't see in a lot of other aircraft when it comes to these fuel control switches. And it changes everything. Take a look at this. In the event of a dual engine failure, despite the fact that these pilots had very, very little time to do anything, the very first memory item is to cut off the fuel control switches. The general procedure is you move them to cut off for about 1 second. See how it says cut off, then run. So you move it down, 1/1000, and you move it back up. The second step is manually deploying the ram air turbine. And the causes for a dual engine failure in this example at high altitude could be fuel leak, fuel starvation, or volcanic ash, which generally you deal with volcanic ash in areas like Hawaii. But I mean, I suppose you can have volcanic ash floating around somewhere, but this seems relatively unlikely. A fuel leak is a possibility that hasn't been talked much about. Usually people talk about the fuel valves being cut off, which ironically is one of the procedure items here. And the reason is you're trying to almost hot start these engines where you cut the fuel flow off, hopefully cool down the turbines a bit, but they're still hot enough and spinning enough to where when you hit them back in, hopefully you can quickly relight. Although you may relight into a stall, the hope is that at any altitude on the 787 Dreamliner, you're able to restart these engines rapidly, regain thrust, and pull out of whatever crisis you're in. Now, it's highly unlikely that any of these procedures would have functioned at 600 feet of altitude, which makes that takeoff altitude such a unfortunate and critical phase of flight. However, if these switches were moved as a memory item to resolve the problem, then it actually suggests that the pilots did exactly what they were supposed to do, which is the opposite of the potential that somebody decided, I'm checking out and I'm taking the plane down with me, I'm going to reach over and I'm going to turn these switches off, which would also accomplish crashing the plane. Now, whoever went for these control switches possibly also manually deployed this ram air turbine. Now, we won't know until obviously we get more official reports out, but what we recognize here is another potential cause is bird strike on both engines, but we don't see that. We don't see that flame out coming out of the end of the engines, which is typical after the ingestion of birds. You don't see the typical sort of like momentary loss of thrust on the left engine and the right engine. You don't see the typical stalling of the engines that you would ordinarily see in a larger bird strike. These aircraft are, after all, designed to withstand bird strikes. Not just the windows, but the engines. They're designed to withstand bird strikes. Larger birds cause problems, or larger flocks of birds, obviously. Of course, some of the threats here would be startle factor, confusion arising from multiple subsystem failures, and a very high workload, especially when you're 600 feet above the ground. Mitigation, prompt recognition of the situation and initiation of the correct memory items. And that may be exactly what they did. Switching the fuel control switches to shut off, or cut off rather, and then run, and then deploying the ram air turbine. Of course, that didn't light the engines, at least from what we could tell, because we never got thrust restored, which then goes back to our list here. Okay, if we remove intentional, while that is still a possibility, let's for a moment remove intentional. We recognize the dual engine failure procedure will call for an automatic or manual deployment of the ram air turbine, so we already know that. We didn't see a bird strike. We're not so worried about gear flap because we know we can fly with those even slightly misconfigured. That's not going to take a plane down. We know we had the dual engine failure, so it really leaves us with some of these issues here. Fuel contamination, some form of fuel pump failure, a very rare case of vapor lock, some form of leak we could write in here, some kind of catastrophic electric failure, which could maybe reset both FADEX, but seems very unlikely. And this is why I started this segment off by saying, you know, this really raises more questions than answers at this point. But it is possible, and it's worth noting, that the pilots did exactly what they were supposed to do, which then just brings us back to, how did one of these things fail? And we still have this remaining question of, why have GE and Boeing not put out some kind of emergency update? Maybe they don't have the answer yet, or maybe there was another cause we're not looking at yet or aware of yet. We'll see as more data comes out, but I wanted to make this update as soon as possible. And if any of this makes you nervous about flying, remember you can always get life insurance from our sponsor at metkevin.com/life. That's metkevin.com, so metkevin, like you got to know me because you just got to know me. metkevin.com/life, get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes, and it's the same life insurance my wife and I use, and you can Apple Pay or Android Pay for it. metkevin.com/life.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.